In today's episode, we dive into the most brutal revenge deaths ever recorded. From jealous lovers who turned scenic cliff edges into instruments of calculated murder, to workplace saboteurs whose petty vendettas escalated into fatal mechanical failures that claimed lives in the most unforgiving ways. It was December 30th, 2016, in New Orleans, Louisiana, as the city slipped into the final nights before New Year's Eve. Music spilled from venues across the Arts District, and one compact nightclub was operating well beyond its intended limits. The building was old, retrofitted piecemeal over decades, with narrow corridors, minimal ventilation, and interior modifications made to prioritize atmosphere over safety. The promoter overseeing the event was Zadie Klump, 38, a fixture in the local music scene known for packing popular acts into undersized spaces. Publicly, she was all efficiency and confidence. Privately, she maintained close, often blurred personal relationships with the people who worked for her, keeping loyalty through promises she rarely intended to keep. That night's event was sold out, with staff instructed to keep auxiliary rooms closed to the public to preserve the main floor's flow. One of those rooms was a small backstage office Zadie regularly used during shows, a converted storage space with foam-lined walls, a single inward-opening door, and no exterior ventilation. It was never intended for prolonged occupancy, but it had become her habitual retreat during performances. 3 months earlier, Brandon Cabello, 29, had worked sound for the same venue. His relationship with Zadie had extended beyond work, built on late nights, private reassurances, and repeated promises that he had a future with her and the business. When he began raising concerns about blocked exits, overloaded circuits, and flammable materials, her tone changed. She dismissed him as unstable, cut him off professionally, and quietly ensured he would not be hired elsewhere. Brandon's career and the relationship he believed in ended almost overnight. He did not report her. Instead, Brandon studied the building. He learned how smoke behaved inside older clubs, how quickly foam-lined rooms filled with toxic gases, and how long it took before anyone recognized a problem beyond the stage lights. He focused on the backstage office Zadie used every show, the one place she would be alone while the crowd remained distracted. Earlier that afternoon, Brandon accessed the building under the pretense of retrieving old equipment. He placed additional storage cases against the backstage office door, reducing its swing and partially obstructing the exit. Inside the room, he concealed a timed electrical heat source near the foam-lined wall, designed to activate later and produce thick, toxic smoke without drawing attention beforehand. The setup would not draw immediate attention from the main floor. He left the building before doors opened. As the headlining act began their set, the club filled with sound and movement. Zadie retreated to the backstage office as she often did, closing the door behind her to escape the noise. From inside, the music became a dull vibration. Moments later, the concealed ignition began to burn. The foam-lined walls produced dense black smoke almost immediately. The confined space trapped heat and toxic fumes, filling the room from the ceiling down. Zadie coughed and moved toward the door, but the added obstruction made it difficult to open fully. Smoke stung her eyes and burned her throat as she struggled to breathe. The club outside continued uninterrupted. Within minutes, the air inside the office became unbreathable. The burning foam released chemical-laden smoke that rapidly deprived her body of oxygen. Zadie collapsed near the door, disoriented and gasping, unable to clear the space before losing consciousness. It was only when smoke began seeping into a service hallway that staff realized something was wrong. By the time the door was forced open, the office was filled with thick smoke and extreme heat. Emergency responders arrived shortly after and pronounced Zadie dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause as acute smoke inhalation from toxic combustion byproducts. Investigators determined the ignition had been deliberate. Surveillance footage and access records identified Brandon Cabello, who initially denied involvement and claimed he had been retrieving equipment earlier that day. Months later, confronted with mounting forensic evidence and access logs, Brandon admitted to setting the fire and acknowledged that he knew the office's conditions made survival unlikely. Prosecutors concluded the act was targeted and intentional. Brandon Cabello was charged with second-degree murder and, in 2018, was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. The nightclub was permanently closed following the investigation. It was May 21st, 2017, in Asheville, North Carolina. Xylee Prant, 26-year-old freelance graphic designer, had spent most of her weekend working from her second-floor apartment. Known for her meticulous attention to detail, she preferred predictability over risk. That preference was survival. She lived with a life-threatening allergy to cow's milk protein that had nearly killed her the year before. Her airway had swollen so rapidly that physicians struggled to stabilize her breathing. Since then, she carried 2 epinephrine auto-injectors at all times and structured her life around avoidance. She verified ingredient lists and refused even thoughtful gestures if she could not confirm their safety. Her breakup with Brandon Hale, a 30-year-old construction worker, had not ended quietly. What began as tension escalated into control, questioning who she spoke to, criticizing her independence, resenting boundaries she set. When she ended the relationship firmly and he refused to accept it, she documented his behavior. 2 weeks before her death, she obtained a domestic violence protective order under North Carolina's 50B statute after repeated unwanted visits. Security footage captured his truck circling the complex. The complaint cost him more than pride. Co-workers became aware. His employer issued a warning. Mutual friends distanced themselves. The separation, in his view, was humiliation. He had been present during her prior allergic emergency and watched medical staff explain how minimal dairy exposure could close her airway. In the months following their breakup, he searched online for information about allergens and whether cooking altered allergenic potency. That Sunday evening, Xylee found a sealed takeout container at her door in an insulated bag. A printed label identified it as dairy-free roasted garlic pasta with almond cream sauce. A handwritten note bore her friend's name, referencing an inside joke. She had confided to that friend earlier about skipping dinner. She sent a brief message of thanks, but received no response. The packaging appeared professional. The ingredient list named almond milk, nutritional yeast, olive oil, garlic, and salt. She examined it carefully. What she could not see was the calculated effort behind it. The label had been printed at home, the note forged, the meal prepared with heavy cream, butter, and Parmesan. After hours of work, and reassured by what appeared legitimate, she allowed herself to trust it. Within minutes of eating, a dry cough developed. Tingling spread across her lips. Swelling followed. Her throat tightened, airflow narrowing. Recognition brought panic. She retrieved her epinephrine auto-injector with trembling hands. As she positioned it against her thigh, her grip faltered, and the device slipped beneath a chair. Dizziness intensified as she reached for it. When she pressed it against her thigh, the device clicked, but her arm jerked, preventing full deployment. Her breathing deteriorated. She dialed emergency services, but speech was fragmented and gasping. Responders arrived 9 minutes later. Xylee was found on her side, cyanosis visible around her lips and fingernails. Paramedics administered epinephrine and oxygen. Her blood pressure had dropped significantly. She lost consciousness. Cardiac arrest followed due to respiratory failure. In the emergency department, intubation proved extremely difficult because of swelling. A surgical airway was performed, but prolonged oxygen deprivation had caused severe brain injury. She was pronounced deceased hours later. Laboratory analysis revealed high concentrations of milk proteins in the pasta, inconsistent with the label. Almond-based components were absent. The label had been produced using a home printer. Surveillance footage showed Brandon Hale purchasing heavy cream, Parmesan, butter, and pasta that day. Digital analysis revealed searches regarding allergen persistence and disguising ingredients. Draft messages reflected resentment over the harassment complaint. The insulated bag matched one in his possession. Label paper and a recently used ink cartridge were recovered from his apartment. Residual sauce in his saucepan chemically matched the sauce in Xylee's container. Prosecutors argued the act was retaliatory. The forged identity, falsified label, and timing established motive. The meal was a calculated instrument of revenge, exploiting a known medical vulnerability. The jury convicted Brandon Hale of second-degree murder, concluding he acted with malice and awareness of the fatal consequences, despite defense arguments that he only intended to make her ill. He was sentenced to 24 years in state prison. It was June 3rd, 2018, when a 12-story apartment building in Denver, Colorado, became the setting for a fatal incident that unfolded quietly inside a stalled elevator. The mid-rise complex housed more than 200 residents and relied on a single passenger elevator for daily access between floors. In the weeks leading up to the incident, tenants had submitted repeated complaints about unexpected stops and brief shutdowns, issues attributed to aging control components. Baxley Gort, 45, served as the building's property manager and had overseen operations for 6 years. His management style emphasized cost containment, often delaying non-emergency repairs. Maintenance logs later showed that several elevator service recommendations had been postponed, including adjustments to door zone sensors and upgrades to the automatic reset system. Steve Walsh, 31, worked as a contracted elevator maintenance technician assigned to the building. Over 3 years, Walsh had submitted multiple reports warning that the elevator's control relays were prone to misalignment and that the automatic restart feature should not be disabled outside of scheduled service windows. His concerns were repeatedly dismissed by Gort, who viewed the recommendations as excessive. The conflict escalated after Walsh's elderly mother, a tenant in the building, was trapped twice in the elevator during separate malfunctions. Following those incidents, Walsh pressed for immediate repairs. Instead, his overtime hours were reduced, and he was warned against filing further complaints. Phone records later showed tense exchanges between the two men in the days that followed. On the afternoon of June 3rd, Walsh accessed the elevator control room under the pretense of routine inspection. Investigators later determined that he placed the elevator into service mode, disabling its automatic restart function, and made a minor adjustment to the door zone sensor that increased the likelihood of the car stopping between floors. The changes did not trigger fault alerts and would appear consistent with routine maintenance activity. That evening, Gort entered the elevator alone in the lobby, intending to travel to the upper floors to address tenant complaints. As the car passed between the 6th and 7th floors, it abruptly halted and entered a locked service state. The doors remained closed, and the car did not automatically reset. Gort attempted to use the emergency call button, which connected to a monitoring service. Records showed that the signal was received, but the call was logged as a non-urgent elevator fault due to the building's prior history of false alarms. The elevator's ventilation fan continued operating, but air circulation was limited. Over the next hour, Gort remained confined inside the stalled car. That evening, Denver was experiencing unseasonably high temperatures, and the elevator quickly became overheated despite limited ventilation. Surveillance footage from the lobby showed maintenance staff assuming the elevator had temporarily shut down and would reset on its own. No immediate rescue attempt was initiated. Inside the car, Gort experienced increasing distress. The medical examiner later noted that he had a documented history of hypertension. Prolonged confinement, rising anxiety, and physical stress likely contributed to a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. After nearly 2 hours, a resident reported the stalled elevator to building security. Technicians manually reset the system and opened the doors. Gort was found collapsed on the floor of the car, unresponsive. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. The autopsy determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrhythmia precipitated by extreme stress during prolonged confinement. There was no evidence of mechanical trauma. The investigation focused on the elevator's control logs, which showed that the automatic restart function had been intentionally disabled earlier that day. Investigators also recovered a jumper wire, bridging the safety circuit, indicating the system had been deliberately bypassed rather than failing naturally. Access records placed Walsh in the control room during the relevant window. Phone messages recovered from his device revealed resentment toward Gort and statements suggesting that being trapped for a while would teach him a lesson. While Walsh denied intending Gort's death, investigators concluded that he knowingly created a dangerous situation by disabling safety features and anticipating a delayed response. Prosecutors argued that the act demonstrated deliberate disregard for human life. Walsh was arrested and charged with first-degree murder under Colorado's extreme indifference statute, with prosecutors arguing that disabling safety systems in an occupied elevator created a grave risk of death. He was later convicted and sentenced to decades in prison, citing aggravating factors related to deliberate safety tampering. The building subsequently replaced its elevator systems and revised emergency response protocols. It was March 15, 2017, in a private marina along Florida's Gulf Coast. The sun was setting over calm waters as weekend boaters prepared their vessels for another day on the water. Cassius Pembroke was a 34-year-old real estate developer who owned a 40-foot speedboat. He had received multiple warnings from marina staff about reckless driving, but used connections with management to avoid formal citations on at least 3 occasions. Bastian Cromwell was a 41-year-old marine mechanic who had worked at the marina for over 15 years. He had an 8-year-old son and cared for his elderly father, often taking both fishing on weekends. On Memorial Day weekend, Cassius operated his speedboat at high speeds in a crowded channel, weaving between smaller vessels. His wake caused Bastian's small fishing boat to capsize, throwing his son and father into choppy water 40 yards from the nearest dock. Bastian dove in immediately, but couldn't reach them in time. Rescue boats arrived within 8 minutes. Both had drowned. After 18 months of legal proceedings, Cassius pleaded to reduce charges of negligent operation and received probation, community service, and a temporary boating license suspension. The civil settlement was sealed. 7 weeks later, Cassius returned to the marina. Multiple employees reported overhearing him say that people who couldn't afford proper boats or swimming lessons shouldn't be on the water. Bastian continued working at the marina. Over the next several months, he began offering discounted maintenance services, giving him unrestricted access to the docks, including where Cassius kept his 42-foot yacht. Weather forecasts for Saturday, June 10th, showed a low-pressure system expected by early afternoon. Small craft advisories were issued for after 2 p.m., and later radar analysis showed a fast-moving offshore storm cell developing earlier than forecast. Forecasters warned conditions could deteriorate rapidly. Cassius and his fiancée departed at 8:45 a.m. Bastian had accessed the yacht the previous evening. He later confessed to creating subtle micro-perforations in a fuel line connection, causing gradual air intrusion that would lead to fuel starvation once the boat was miles offshore. The engine began failing at 10:15 a.m., 6 miles from shore. Cassius attempted multiple restarts, but the fuel system was compromised too severely. The yacht lost all propulsion. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly. Wind speed increased from 12 miles per hour to 28 miles per hour within 20 minutes. Without engine power, the boat became uncontrollable. At 10:35 a.m., an 8 to 10 foot wave struck the yacht broadside in beam seas, causing it to roll sharply. Both occupants were thrown overboard. Neither wore a life jacket. The yacht's swim platform was damaged and partially submerged during the roll. The hull drifted downwind at approximately 2 knots, moving away from them. Water temperature was 74 degrees. Waves reached 6 to 8 feet. A second wave struck 3 minutes later, separating them by 40 to 50 feet. Wave action, wind drift, and the yacht's movement made swimming back impossible. A passing fishing vessel spotted Cassius 12 minutes after he entered the water. They reached him at 10:52 a.m. He was unconscious. His fiancée was located at 11:08 a.m., unresponsive and floating face down. Both were pronounced dead upon arrival at the marina. The medical examiner determined both died from drowning. Coast Guard investigators discovered fuel system tampering inconsistent with normal wear. Marina surveillance showed Bastian accessing the yacht the night before. Bastian confessed, describing weeks of planning and researching weather patterns to ensure conditions would deteriorate that Saturday. Bastian was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. It was July 22, 2016, at a residential complex in Tampa, Florida, where evening humidity hung thick and temperatures remained in the mid-80s despite the late hour. The facility featured a large community pool with a retractable fiberglass cover system. The pool had been partially drained for maintenance, exposing several feet of concrete walls above the waterline. Harlan West, a 34-year-old night maintenance worker, was completing his final rounds before scheduled repairs. He was known for his professionalism in ensuring recreational facilities remained safe and functional. Noah Briggs, a 29-year-old resident of the complex, had been involved in an escalating dispute with West over noise complaints. West lived in an adjacent unit and had filed multiple complaints with the Homeowners Association about late-night gatherings at Briggs's apartment that violated community quiet hours. These complaints had resulted in fines totaling over $1,500 for Briggs and a formal warning that further violations could result in lease termination. Text messages recovered later from Briggs's phone contained hostile references to West and statements about teaching him a lesson for ruining his life over nothing. Briggs had become increasingly agitated about the financial burden of the fines and what he perceived as West's excessive interference in his personal activities. The pool cover system consisted of motorized tracks and a large fiberglass panel that could be extended across the water surface. That evening, West was conducting his standard closing inspection of the pool area. A resident operating a recreational drone captured footage during West's inspection, recording him walking along the pool's edge, examining the cover mechanism. Briggs had accessed the pool equipment area earlier that day and loosened several critical anchor bolts beneath the fiberglass cover. These bolts were essential structural components that distributed the cover's weight across the support framework. Briggs later claimed he intended only to create a malfunction that would reflect poorly on West's maintenance work and potentially get him reprimanded by management. As West stepped onto the pool deck adjacent to the cover's track to complete his inspection, the compromised support system experienced progressive anchor bolt failure. The fiberglass panel, carrying a distributed load of several hundred pounds across its support framework, collapsed without warning. West fell 9 feet onto the exposed concrete bottom of the partially drained pool, striking the hard surface with significant force. The collapsing cover material fell on top of him, creating additional impact trauma. The drone footage captured the sudden structural failure and West's fall, though the angle prevented clear visibility of the final impact. Multiple fractures to his skull and spine occurred upon contact with the concrete surface, and movement ceased within seconds of the collapse. The resident operating the drone immediately contacted emergency services after witnessing the accident. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but found West unresponsive beneath the collapsed cover material. He was pronounced dead at the scene from traumatic injuries, consistent with a high-impact fall onto concrete. Investigators examining the pool cover system discovered tool marks on the loosened anchor bolts that matched equipment found in Briggs's apartment. The drone footage provided clear evidence of the structural failure sequence, and engineering analysis confirmed that the cover would not have collapsed without the deliberate tampering. Text message records and witness statements about the ongoing dispute established Briggs's motive. Briggs initially denied involvement, but later admitted to loosening the bolts, claiming he intended only to create a mechanical failure that would embarrass West professionally. Structural engineers determined that loosening the anchor bolts caused uneven load redistribution, resulting in progressive shear failure across the remaining supports, making catastrophic collapse inevitable under normal operating conditions. Briggs was charged with manslaughter under Florida law. Following his conviction, he was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. The case prompted new inspection requirements for pool cover systems and stricter penalties for tampering with shared recreational facilities in residential complexes. It was June 18, 2017, at a municipal skate plaza in Oregon, where a drained 8-foot deep pool with shallow fetid rainwater created a dangerous concrete landing area. Damon Fox, a 41-year-old freelance content creator, had spent 3 years documenting skateboarding accidents for his social media channels. Known for his predatory filming, he had developed a notorious reputation for exploiting embarrassing moments for viral impact. His aggressive pursuit of dramatic footage had earned him over thousands of followers, but widespread contempt within the skating scene. That afternoon, Damon had positioned himself near the pool section with his chest-mounted camera. Among the skaters was Trent Hollis, a 38-year-old maintenance worker who had become the unwilling victim of Damon's most vindictive campaign. Over 5 months, Damon had targeted Trent repeatedly, posting 3 increasingly degrading videos of his falls and mistakes. The most recent, posted 3 weeks earlier, showed Trent lying on the ground in obvious pain, while Damon zoomed in on his face and and provided sarcastic narration mocking weekend skaters. The video had been viewed over 1,000 times. Trent's employer had seen it. Co-workers ridiculed him relentlessly. He received harassing messages from strangers, and his teenage daughter faced bullying at school because of it. When Trent confronted Damon and begged him to remove the videos, Damon laughed in his face, dismissed his concerns as mere business, then filmed that confrontation too, posting it with a caption suggesting Trent couldn't handle a joke. The humiliation had consumed Trent, costing him sleep and straining his family relationships. He formulated a calculated plan for revenge that mirrored his own experience. Trent knew Damon would position himself at the edge of the drained pool for the best filming angle. His plan was to damage the concrete surface near the edge. He would use his work tools to chip and roughen a specific spot where Damon typically stood, creating an uneven surface that would cause him to slip and fall into the shallow pool below. It would be the same kind of embarrassing fall that Damon had mocked Trent for, captured on Damon's own chest camera. Trent had even brought his phone to film the reaction and posted online with mocking commentary, giving Damon a taste of his own medicine. He intended only a humiliating tumble into the water that would ruin Damon's expensive equipment. The chest-mounted camera captured what followed. When Damon took his usual position at the pool's edge, filming nearby skaters, Trent approached with his heavy work chisel. Earlier that afternoon, during a quieter moment, Trent had already scored and chipped a section of the concrete lip where Damon stood, creating an imperceptible but treacherous uneven surface. As Damon shifted his weight to follow a skater's movement, his foot caught on the damaged section. He lost his balance completely, falling backward into the empty basin and striking his head against the concrete wall before sliding down into the shallow water at the bottom. The impact caused immediate skull fractures, and he lost consciousness instantly, collapsing motionless in the chemically tainted water. Trent stood frozen in horror. Other skaters called emergency services. The chest-mounted camera continued recording, providing clear evidence of the fall. The damaged concrete section was discovered during the investigation. Emergency crews arrived within minutes and rushed Damon to a trauma center, where he was pronounced dead from blunt force head injuries sustained in the 8-foot fall. Investigators determined Trent had deliberately damaged the concrete edge to make Damon slip, finding notes describing the plan and tool marks matching his chisel. He was charged with voluntary manslaughter after prosecutors said the sabotage showed reckless disregard for life. Trent admitted he meant only to humiliate him, never imagining the fall would be fatal. It was April 22, 2018, inside a commercial climbing gym in Boulder, Colorado. The afternoon was quiet and routine. Music played softly. Chalk dust settled on the mats, staff rotated stations, climbers followed their usual patterns. Safety procedures were treated as standard, familiar, and unquestioned. Mark Jensen was 35, a freelance graphic designer who took contract work from outdoor brands and tech startups. He climbed to decompress after deadlines and treated the gym like a workspace where speed mattered. He was skilled, demanding, and openly dismissive of safety reminders, correcting staff loudly and publicly. Regulars recognized him immediately and kept their distance. Tyler Reed was 23, a college student working floor shifts between classes. He handled harness checks and ropes and absorbed Mark's insults without responding. Mark mocked his training, questioned his competence, and once recorded him during a correction. Management warned Mark twice, but prioritized his membership. Tyler stayed for tuition money, logging hours carefully and saying nothing. That Sunday afternoon, Mark arrived, insisting on a fast lead climb despite reduced staffing. A route had been reset overnight and was longer and steeper than usual. A posted notice required assisted belays only. Tyler volunteered to belay. Gym cameras later showed him threading the assisted braking device correctly, then deliberately holding the cam disengaged before clipping it to his harness. Mark ignored the posted notice, clipped in, and stepped onto the wall without a partner check. From the floor, nothing looked wrong. The belay device sat in place, and the rope fed cleanly as if properly set. Music continued playing overhead. Chalk hung in the air as Tyler paid rope out smoothly, his hands steady, his stance squared. Nearby climbers glanced over, saw nothing alarming, and went back to their routes. About halfway up, Mark rushed a sequence, skipping a foothold to save time. His shoes skidded on polished holds worn smooth by years of use. He laughed, shook it off, and kept moving, climbing higher until he was nearly 40 feet above the mat. Below him, Tyler shifted his feet and leaned back slightly, but the rope never caught. A few climbers stopped and watched, sensing something off in the silence. No one spoke, no alarm sounded. Mark's right foot suddenly blew off the hold. His body swung away from the wall. There was no resistance, no tightening the rope. He dropped straight down, accelerating fast enough that the air tore past him. His shoulders slammed into the wall first, snapping his body sideways. He struck again, lower, spinning, his helmet cracking sharply against the surface. He hit the mat hard, folding forward at the waist, legs still lifted as his spine bent far past its limit. The impact forced all the air from his lungs in a single violent burst. His body went still immediately. Tyler never applied tension to the brake strand. As Mark hit the mat, the rope followed a second later, sliding freely through the device and pooling beside him. Dark blood began to spread across Mark's shirt. His face flushed, then quickly turned dusky. A front desk employee hit the emergency button at 2:41 p.m. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Paramedics arrived 7 minutes later and pronounced Mark dead at the scene. Surveillance footage showed the belay device threaded correctly, with the cam deliberately prevented from engaging. Investigators confirmed the route height, fall distance, and mat placement. The equipment functioned as designed, and the failure was determined to be intentional. The coroner determined Mark died within seconds. The fall ruptured his liver and spleen, causing massive internal bleeding. His spine sustained fatal flexion injuries. There was no chance of resuscitation. The cause of death was blunt force trauma from an uncontrolled fall. The gym closed for 3 days. Tyler confessed after reenactment tests proved the belay could not fail accidentally. He was charged with second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in Colorado State Prison. Mark's client deadlines went unanswered, and the death was recorded as a workplace homicide in Boulder County court records. Mark fell because someone below him decided the rules no longer applied. The next death didn't happen on solid ground. It unfolded underwater, where trust between two people became the difference between survival and a fatal mistake. It was July 19, 2016, and the high desert west toward Kingman baked under a blazing afternoon sun. Interstate 40 shimmered with heat waves as traffic moved steadily across the open stretch. The temperature had climbed to 98 degrees, and most drivers kept their windows up, relying on air conditioning to battle the heat. Merrick Vane, a 47-year-old trucking company owner, had built his business from nothing over 2 decades. Known for his demanding management style, he ran a tight operation that prioritized schedules over comfort. His drivers often complained about the grueling routes he assigned, but Merrick believed that success required sacrifice. Tony Carlisle, 34, had worked as a driver for Merrick's company until 3 weeks earlier. The breaking point had come during a heated confrontation in Merrick's office. Tony had completed an 18-hour haul and was being ordered to immediately take another long-distance route without the federally mandated rest period. When Tony refused, citing safety regulations, Merrick had exploded with anger, calling him weak and unreliable. Merrick threatened to blacklist Tony with other trucking companies. After refusing to complete a 20-hour haul without proper rest, he'd been fired on the spot. The termination had left him bitter and struggling financially. Earlier that morning, Tony had accessed the company lot and tampered with Merrick's pickup truck. He'd jumped the horn relay inside the fuse box, choosing a failure he knew would interfere once the vehicle was already in traffic. The idea was simple in execution, but deliberate in intent. Force Merrick into a moment of helpless exposure behind the wheel. Around 3:30 p.m., Merrick left the depot in his pickup, unaware of the modification. His dashboard camera was recording as usual, a habit he'd developed for insurance purposes. As Merrick merged onto the main highway, he leaned on the horn at a slower vehicle ahead. The horn immediately stuck, producing a continuous ear-piercing blast that couldn't be stopped. The sound was deafening inside the cab, and the relentless noise was overwhelming in the enclosed space, making it difficult to think clearly. What followed was a series of distracted maneuvers that proved fatal. Merrick swerved slightly right toward the shoulder, then overcorrected back toward the travel lane as he fumbled beneath the dashboard, trying to silence the horn while driving. His attention divided between the road and the malfunction. He braked erratically, slowing without signaling. Behind him, a fully loaded semi-truck was being driven by Carl Morton, who was nearing the end of his legal driving window. Fatigued and momentarily distracted, Carl looked up just as Merrick's pickup swerved and braked unpredictably. He slammed on his brakes, but the 80,000-pound vehicle couldn't stop in time. The massive truck struck Merrick's pickup from behind, crumpling the rear end and sending the smaller vehicle spinning across 2 lanes. The pickup careened toward the guardrail. Merrick, who habitually drove without wearing his seatbelt, was violently thrown against the driver's side door as the vehicle rotated. The truck struck the guardrail at an angle, and the impact compressed the driver's side of the cab inward. The steering wheel was driven into Merrick's chest with crushing force. The collision caused severe blunt force trauma to his chest and abdomen, fracturing multiple ribs and causing catastrophic internal injuries. His head struck the door frame repeatedly, resulting in massive skull fractures and brain trauma. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, but Merrick was pronounced dead at the scene. The combination of crushing chest injuries, head trauma, and internal hemorrhaging had been immediately fatal. Police investigators traced the horn malfunction back to Tony through security footage and witness statements. When confronted, Tony admitted to sabotaging the vehicle, though he later claimed he had not expected the situation to escalate beyond his control. Dashcam footage confirmed that Merrick's distraction, combined with delayed braking from the fatigued semi-truck driver, triggered the collision. Investigators determined the semi-driver had remained within legal driving limits and was not charged. Tony was charged with involuntary manslaughter and later sentenced to multiple years in state prison. The case closed with prosecutors citing intentional vehicle interference as the initiating cause of death. It was August 22, 2016, at a downtown construction site in Atlanta, Georgia, where summer heat had baked the soil dry and compact around a 15-story office building still months from completion. The project was behind schedule, and crews had been working extended shifts to keep underground utility work on track before concrete pours began. The site required multiple trenches dug along the eastern perimeter of the building, some reaching depths of nearly 12 feet to accommodate electrical conduits and water lines. According to federal safety standards, any excavation deeper than 5 feet required protective shoring to prevent soil collapse. On this site, steel trench panels and hydraulic braces were used, but inspections had been inconsistent as deadlines tightened. Darrow Clint, 41, served as head foreman and was responsible for approving trench setups before crews entered them. Workers later described Clint as dismissive of safety concerns, often pushing installations forward even when protective systems were incomplete. Complaints about his management had circulated quietly among the crew for months, but few were willing to challenge him directly. Tommy Rodriguez, 25, operated heavy equipment on site and had clashed repeatedly with Clint over denied overtime and delayed safety requests. In the weeks leading up to the incident, the tension escalated. Rodriguez believed Clint was deliberately blocking his advancement and had threatened to ensure he would never work another major construction project in the city. 3 days before the trench collapse, an argument between the two men was witnessed by several co-workers near the equipment staging area. After that confrontation, Rodriguez was reassigned to excavator duties along the eastern trench line, where he had early access during morning setup. On the day of the incident, the trench had been dug to full depth, but the shoring system was improperly installed. One steel panel along the north wall was not fully secured, and the spacing between supports did not match the soil conditions, which consisted of dense clay layered with loose fill from previous excavation. Despite this, Clint approved entry into the trench to verify conduit placement. A documentation camera mounted near the edge of the excavation captured the early stages of the collapse. As Clint moved along the trench floor, the unsupported section of wall began to bow inward. Within seconds, thousands of pounds of soil broke free and poured into the excavation, burying him from the waist down and pinning his chest against the opposite wall. Workers heard Clint shouting briefly before the remaining soil settled. His hard hat and one shoulder remained visible above the collapsed edge, but the trench walls continued to shift, making immediate rescue impossible. Attempts to dig by hand were stopped due to the risk of a secondary collapse that could bury additional workers. Emergency responders arrived and secured the area, bringing in specialized vacuum excavation equipment to remove soil safely. The recovery took several hours. Clint was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later confirmed compressive asphyxiation as the cause of death, noting that the pressure of the soil prevented his chest from expanding, causing suffocation within minutes. The investigation determined that the trench had been approved despite clear safety deficiencies, including missing locking components and improper panel spacing that did not match the soil conditions. Equipment logs showed that Rodriguez had been responsible for early setup along the north wall of the trench and had bypassed a required locking pin on one steel panel, a step necessary to stabilize the shoring system. Phone records showed that Rodriguez had searched for information related to trench collapses and excavation failures the night before the incident. Investigators also recovered messages sent to co-workers expressing anger toward Clint and resentment over repeated threats to his career. While no direct confession was found, the combination of intentional safety tampering, access, and prior conflict supported the conclusion that the collapse was not accidental. Rodriguez was arrested and charged with felony murder, with prosecutors arguing that Clint's death occurred during the commission of a criminal act involving deliberate safety sabotage. A jury later convicted him, and he was sentenced to decades in prison. It was October 8, 2015, in the remote wilderness of northwestern Montana, within an early-season backcountry hunting district where rifle elk season had already opened. Experienced guides moved through dense forest corridors that stretched for miles without paved access roads. Hunting parties were common during that time of year, but the isolation of the terrain meant that once a group traveled deep enough into the backcountry, outside contact depended almost entirely on satellite communication. Dorian Ashcroft was a 31-year-old investment banker from New York. Civil records later referenced multiple internal complaints tied to inappropriate workplace relationships during his tenure at a financial firm. Octavius Whitmore, a 53-year-old former financial advisor, had previously known Dorian through professional circles. His 19-year-old daughter had interned at the same firm. During that internship, Dorian initiated a relationship with her that eventually resulted in pregnancy. Records later indicated she struggled to find new work after leaving the firm. Medical documentation showed she received treatment through low-cost community clinics where complications developed during the pregnancy. She later died while receiving care at a public medical facility, with the medical examiner listing pregnancy-related complications as the cause of death. Following her death, Octavius relocated to Montana and began working as a hunting guide. Licensing records confirmed he possessed extensive outdoor experience and familiarity with backcountry terrain. Months later, Dorian booked a guided hunt through an outfitter service that subcontracted to Octavius's operation. Booking paperwork suggested Dorian was unaware of the personal connection between them. On October 11th, the two men traveled roughly 12 miles into a forested area known for elk movement, using pack horses supplied through the outfitter to transport gear into the backcountry camp. Terrain reports described uneven elevation, fallen timber, and limited lines of sight between ridges. As daylight began to fade at approximately 4:45 p.m., Dorian moved ahead to examine fresh tracks near a fallen log. Moments later, a rifle shot echoed through the trees. The round struck him from behind at a downward angle, consistent with a shooter positioned on slightly elevated terrain. Investigators later noted that the topography matched the firing position Octavius described in his confession. Octavius placed a satellite phone call at 4:52 p.m., reporting that he had heard a shot and believed another hunter may have accidentally discharged a weapon. Due to distance and fading light, search and rescue teams reached the location the following morning. Dorian was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators initially classified the incident as a hunting accident caused by an unknown party. The recovered bullet matched common calibers used by hunters in the region, and early trajectory analysis did not immediately rule out an accidental discharge. Octavius stated that his own rifle had been fired earlier in the day during an unsuccessful attempt to shoot an elk, and no immediate physical evidence contradicted his explanation. 6 months later, Octavius contacted local law enforcement and requested another interview. During questioning, he provided a full confession, stating that he had deliberately guided Dorian into a remote location and fired the fatal shot himself before staging the scene to resemble an accident. According to his recorded statement, he had spoken with a religious counselor before deciding to come forward. Ballistic re-examination conducted after the confession aligned the bullet trajectory with Octavius's admitted firing position, supporting the revised conclusion that the shooting had been intentional rather than accidental. Authorities arrested Octavius and charged him with first-degree murder. Court proceedings focused on the planning involved in selecting an isolated hunting zone and the delayed admission of responsibility. He ultimately entered a guilty plea in exchange for removal of the death penalty as a sentencing option. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, formally closing the investigation and reclassifying the incident as a deliberate act of revenge carried out under the appearance of a hunting accident. It was March 3, 2018, at a small regional airport in Montana. Morning light spread over snow-lined ridges. The tarmac lay open beneath a pale blue sky with light winds out of the west at about 8 miles per hour and temperature around 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Alan Crane, 44, co-owned a commercial real estate firm and often flew a single-engine Cessna to inspection sites. In January, he audited income streams and found underreported receipts and false maintenance expenses totaling millions in unreported income over several years. He confronted his partner, Dennis Briggs, 42, in mid-February. Dennis admitted to the fraud, but refused to file amended tax returns, stating it would cost hundreds of thousands in back taxes and potentially bankrupt the company. On March 1st, Alan told Dennis he would contact tax authorities regardless of consequences. Dennis knew he faced years in federal prison if Alan reported the fraud. Afterward, Alan scheduled a Saturday flight to Wyoming for site checks. The night before, someone accessed his tied-down aircraft around 8:45 p.m. A siphon removed roughly 18 gallons from the wing tank. The float arm on the fuel gauge sender was bent with a screwdriver, so the cockpit display would read 3/4 full when the tank held less than 1/4. Alan arrived at 8:15 a.m. His pre-flight focused on the standard walk-around, checking control surfaces, tires, and engine oil, along with visually checking the cockpit's fuel indicator. It showed approximately 3/4 full, what appeared to be plenty for the 320-mile round trip with normal reserves. He did not physically dip the tank with a measuring stick, relying on the gauge as he typically did when it showed adequate fuel. The engine run-up was clean with all instruments appearing normal. He lifted off at 8:51 a.m. and climbed to 9,500 feet, cruising over timbered slopes and long, white meadows. For over an hour, the aircraft ran normally. The gauge descended in a way that appeared consistent for that flight profile. At about 10:10 a.m., the engine went rough, then smoothed briefly. Alan checked his instruments and saw the gauge showing just over 1/4 full. The nearest airport was 42 miles to the southeast. He turned toward that airfield and reduced power to conserve fuel. 6 minutes later, at 10:16 a.m., the engine sputtered more severely. At 10:19 a.m., the engine quit completely as the fuel supply was exhausted. Alan radioed a mayday with his position and altitude and began a best glide descent at approximately 75 miles per hour, descending at about 700 feet per minute. From 9,500 feet, he had roughly 12 minutes of glide time. Terrain around him rose in ridge lines. A thin meadow lay ahead in a valley, but the glide path came up short as the terrain rose toward him. At approximately 10:28 a.m., he was still 400 feet above the clearing when treetops clipped the aircraft at about 65 miles per hour. The impact tore off the left wing and spun the fuselage violently. The aircraft crashed into the ground and tumbled approximately 90 feet through brush and rocks before coming to rest on its side. Two hikers a little over a mile away heard the engine's tone drop and then a heavy thud. They reached the site about 32 minutes later and used a satellite phone to relay coordinates. Alan had died on impact. The rapid deceleration caused his brain to impact his skull with fatal force, his ribs to break and puncture vital organs, and massive internal bleeding, forces the human body cannot survive. Examination showed the tank empty and the fuel gauge sender arm deliberately bent to give a false reading with fresh tool marks. The ground beside the tie-down spot bore fresh fuel staining. Phone records placed Dennis near the airport the night before. Security footage from a nearby gas station captured his truck passing toward the airport and again heading away. A siphon pump recovered from his garage tested positive for aviation fuel traces, and his fingerprints were found on the aircraft's fuel tank access panel. The death was ruled a homicide. Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder and received life in prison without parole. Greed had driven Dennis to sabotage his partner's plane. But in Texas, a father's rage was building over something far more personal: his daughter's assault and the manager who had buried the truth. It was June 3rd, 2016, in a sprawling freight yard outside a small Kansas town where the summer heat had already begun settling into the rail steel by mid-morning. The facility stretched across 40 acres of switching tracks and loading platforms, where massive rail cars sat in long rows waiting to be repositioned for the next shipment. Merrick Boyd, a 38-year-old safety coordinator, had driven out early that Friday to conduct his weekly compliance inspection before the weekend audit. Boyd was methodical by nature, a trait developed during his years as an Army logistics specialist before transitioning to civilian railroad work. His job involved enforcing written safety procedures that many longtime workers viewed as unnecessary bureaucracy. He carried a clipboard and digital camera, documenting violations that could result in hefty federal fines. Most employees tolerated his presence, understanding the regulatory necessity, but a few saw him as an outsider, disrupting their established routines. 3 weeks earlier, Boyd had filed a formal report against Caleb Rourke, a 41-year-old veteran equipment operator who had been disabling safety interlocks to speed up switching operations. The violation cost Rourke his overtime privileges and damaged his informal leadership status among the crew. Text messages recovered later from Rourke's phone contained warnings for Boyd to stay clear of moving equipment, though investigators would determine these were sent after working hours when both men had left the facility. The morning inspection proceeded normally until Boyd reached the eastern section, where two freight cars sat positioned roughly 28 inches apart on parallel tracks. Security cameras captured him walking between the stationary cars, checking brake mechanisms and coupling hardware as required by his checklist. Boyd was foul of the track, positioned within a narrow temporary maintenance spacing used during switching operations, where all equipment movement was required to be locked out. The freight cars themselves were massive steel containers, each weighing over 80 tons when fully loaded with grain shipments destined for coastal ports. Their coupling systems required precise alignment, and the hydraulic brake mechanisms were designed to hold them stationary, even on slight inclines. Boyd had performed this same inspection routine dozens of times without incident, following protocols established after previous accidents at similar facilities across the Midwest. Minutes earlier, a shunting engine remained coupled to the cars and under remote control, with the air brake system fully charged and capable of movement on command. From a remote locomotive control console inside the operations building, Rourke deliberately initiated a brief forward movement command. The rail car lurched forward faster than Rourke had anticipated, closing the gap in under 3 seconds. Boyd was caught chest first between the steel surfaces. Multiple ribs were fractured immediately, puncturing both lungs as the pressure continued. His pelvis and upper thighs were crushed as the weight of the loaded car pressed against him. Blood began pooling beneath the rail before the emergency stop system finally engaged. The security footage would later show his final moments lasted less than 30 seconds from initial impact to complete stillness. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the automated distress signal, but Boyd was pronounced dead at the scene. Control system logs showed the movement command had been activated during a designated exclusion period when personnel were known to be conducting inspections in that section. Phone records revealed deleted text messages that were later recovered through digital forensics. The investigation would reveal that Boyd had been planning to recommend additional safety measures following the upcoming audit. Rourke admitted to investigators that he believed a brief movement would intimidate Boyd without causing harm. Federal railroad safety officials concluded that the fatal compression would not have occurred without the deliberate activation during the restricted time frame. Rourke was charged with involuntary manslaughter with a retaliatory motive and cited by federal investigators for willful violations of railroad safety regulations tied to the unauthorized equipment movement. It was October 19, 2015, on a desert trail in Arizona, where rugged terrain, loose gravel, and steep paths ran beside dangerous 30 to 50-foot drop-offs into sandy ravines. Daniel Culp, a 41-year-old insurance adjuster, had been looking forward to this group ATV ride for several weeks as a way to unwind from recent stress in his personal life. Known among friends for his cautious approach to outdoor activities and methodical attention to safety details, he had participated in similar rides throughout the region for nearly 5 years. That afternoon, Daniel had joined a group of 8 riders for what was planned as a routine 3-hour excursion through the established trail network. The group included Trevor Holt, a 36-year-old construction foreman who had been avoiding Daniel for the past month following a contentious custody hearing. Daniel had provided testimony that contradicted Trevor's claims about his work schedule and availability for parenting responsibilities. The custody case had resulted in Trevor losing significant visitation time with his children, and he blamed Daniel's testimony for influencing the court's decision. Over the previous weeks, Trevor had sent several threatening messages to Daniel through social media, suggesting that there would be consequences for his interference in family matters. Trevor had arrived at the staging area early and positioned himself near the parked ATVs while other riders were completing their safety briefings. He had noticed that Daniel's vehicle was parked at the end of the row, somewhat isolated from the others, and he saw an opportunity to create a mechanical problem that would ruin Daniel's day without causing serious harm. The helmet-mounted camera captured the sequence of events that followed. Trevor approached Daniel's ATV and quietly removed the cotter pin securing the rear axle nut, then used a wrench from his toolkit to loosen the nut by several turns, leaving it tight enough to appear secure during a casual inspection, but loose enough to work free under the stress of trail riding. The group began their excursion with Daniel positioned at the rear of the formation, as was his usual preference for filming the other riders ahead of him. For the first hour, the loosened axle nut held in place as the group navigated relatively flat sections of the trail. However, as they approached a steep incline known for its challenging terrain, the mechanical stress began to take its toll. The helmet camera recorded the moment when Daniel's rear axle assembly began to fail while climbing a rocky slope approximately 40 feet above a sandy ravine. The loosened nut had worked completely free, causing the rear hub to slip off the axle splines and creating immediate instability in the vehicle's handling. Daniel attempted to maintain control as the ATV began to tip sideways, but the steep angle made recovery impossible. The vehicle rolled twice before coming to rest upside down in the ravine below, with Daniel trapped underneath the 450-pound frame. The impact had caused severe crushing injuries to his chest and abdomen, and the remote location made immediate rescue efforts extremely difficult. Other riders in the group called for emergency assistance, but the nearest medical facility was more than 45 minutes away. Emergency medical personnel reached the accident site approximately 1 hour after the initial call, but Daniel was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was massive internal trauma consistent with being crushed by heavy machinery. The separated rear axle and loosened nut were recovered from the trail, providing clear evidence of mechanical tampering. The investigation revealed that Trevor had deliberately sabotaged Daniel's ATV, and the helmet camera footage clearly showed his actions at the staging area before the ride began. Phone records confirmed the threatening messages he had sent in the weeks leading up to the incident, establishing a clear motive for the attack. Trevor was subsequently charged with second-degree murder as investigators determined that his actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for human life. The trail system implemented new safety protocols requiring mandatory mechanical inspections before group rides. It was June 9, 2017, off the coast of Key Largo, Florida. Conditions were ideal. The water was clear, the current mild, and the dive routine. Equipment checks were completed, regulators tested, and partners paired. Everything proceeded according to plan, with no visible signs of error or concern. That morning, Nathan Cole, 29, prepared for the dive. He was an information systems analyst for a regional healthcare network in Orlando. Diving was his escape, something he approached carefully and by the book. His girlfriend, Lena Hart, 28, went with him. She worked in the hospitality industry. She was certified through PADI, Competent but less conservative. Days earlier, she had discovered Nathan's affairs through synced messages. She still boarded the charter, carrying unresolved anger, humiliation, and a desire to confront him on her terms. The dive briefing was routine, but conditions were not. A steady lateral current ran across the reef, forcing constant effort. The planned depth reached 80 feet, where poor decisions become easier. The captain warned divers to ascend slowly. No one objected. Buddy pairs were assigned without discussion. On deck, Lena completed her own checks but skipped Nathan's final air verification. The stern camera later showed her nodding without touching his regulator. Investigators later recovered Nathan's phone from a dry box on the boat. Minutes before entry, he had been texting another woman. Lena saw the messages while standing beside him on deck. She did not react outwardly. She entered the water as planned. They descended along the mooring line and leveled off at depth. Visibility was clear, and the current was persistent. Nathan signaled okay. Lena stayed close. Dive computer data later showed her air supply remained full and stable throughout. At 80 feet, Lena reached forward and disconnected Nathan's low-pressure inflator hose, the quick-release line that controlled his buoyancy. She gestured toward his equipment, palm up, signaling a problem. When he attempted to inflate his buoyancy compensator, nothing happened. His body jolted. He reached for her alternate air source. She pulled it away and kicked backward, widening the distance between them. Nathan's breathing spiked. Panic set in. Unable to control his buoyancy and panicking, he kicked upward instead of stabilizing on the line. As he ascended too fast, pressure inside his lungs expanded violently. Witness divers saw him clutch his chest as pink foam burst from his mouth and streamed into the water. At around 30 feet, his body convulsed. Blood bubbled from his nose and lips. He lost control, rolled onto his side, and continued rising. Two divers tried to intercept him, but were swept off by the current. Nathan broke the surface unconscious, face down beside the boat. A deckhand pulled him aboard as the captain radioed emergency services. Rescue breathing began immediately. Paramedics arrived 22 minutes later and pronounced him dead on scene. The medical examiner found ruptured air sacs in both lungs and air bubbles lodged in major blood vessels, injuries caused by a rapid ascent. There was no water in his lungs. He did not drown. He died from pressure trauma before reaching the surface. Dive computer records, camera footage, and Lena's own pressure logs confirmed she never attempted to share air. She was arrested after investigators recovered the text messages and matched timestamps to the dive sequence. Dive computer data confirmed a sudden, uncontrolled ascent. Investigators also found Lena's fingerprints and skin cells on the inflator hose fitting, and her dive profile showed she never attempted to assist or ascend with her assigned buddy. Lena was charged with second-degree manslaughter and tampering with life support equipment, later sentenced to 18 years in prison. Her certification was permanently revoked. Nathan's parents filed suit, prompting stricter buddy checks, deck cameras, and mandatory air verification protocols across affiliated Florida dive fleets. It was August 5th, 2015, at a small freshwater dive site along the eastern shore of Lake Tahoe, California. The afternoon was warm and windless, with clear skies overhead and calm water below. A group of students had gathered at a wooden dock beside a local dive shop for an open water certification session. Tanks, fins, and weight systems were staged neatly along the planks as instructors prepared for a routine training dive. The lead instructor that day was Keller Bantz, 41, a certified diver with more than a decade of teaching experience. Despite his credentials, Bantz was known for rushing safety checks and dismissing concerns raised by students. Complaints had been made before, but none resulted in formal discipline. He continued leading certification dives without oversight. Watching from the dock was Joseph Drum, 46, whose teenage son had nearly drowned during a previous training session 3 weeks earlier. During that dive, Bantz had failed to verify the boy's equipment before descent, leaving him struggling underwater until another student intervened. When Joseph confronted Bantz afterward, the instructor minimized the incident and warned that further complaints could jeopardize the boy's certification. No report was filed. No changes were made. Joseph did not pursue legal action. Instead, he researched diving fatalities and focused on one critical failsafe: ballast release. Without it, a diver who runs low on air cannot surface. At depth, panic accelerates breathing. Air depletes rapidly, and rescue, if it comes at all, often arrives too late. Earlier that morning, while instructors were distracted preparing equipment, Joseph accessed Bantz's gear. He focused on the integrated weight system, deliberately disabling the quick release so it would move but not disengage. The alteration was hidden and would pass a routine visual check. Joseph tested it twice before leaving it in place. He then chose the timing and depth carefully, between 50 and 60 feet, knowing that once Bantz's air supply dropped, the instructor would be unable to surface. Joseph accepted that outcome. The dive began without incident. Bantz descended first, settling near the lake bed to demonstrate buoyancy control. Students followed at a distance, some recording the dive with mounted cameras. The water was cold and clear, the low temperature at depth tightening his muscles and accelerating his breathing. Visibility was excellent. Minutes into the dive, Bantz signaled an ascent drill. He attempted to rise and failed. Assuming a minor buoyancy issue, he fully inflated his buoyancy compensator and kicked harder. He remained pinned low in the water. Bantz reached for his weight release. It did not disengage. He tried again, pulling harder. The handle moved, but the weight stayed locked. His breathing rate spiked under stress and his pressure gauge dropped rapidly as he kicked upward. Students nearby recorded his movements as he signaled distress and attempted to swim free of the ballast holding him down. The effort only worsened the situation. As his air supply dropped, Bantz's movements became erratic. He kicked violently, stirring sediment from the lake bed. His breathing grew rapid and shallow. The buoyancy compensator provided limited lift, nowhere near enough to overcome the trapped weights. When his regulator ran dry, Bantz attempted one final ascent. He rose briefly, then sank back toward the bottom. By the time additional instructors reached him, he was motionless. Bantz was brought to the surface and pulled onto the dock, where emergency responders initiated resuscitation. It failed. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as asphyxiation due to drowning, with contributing factors including exhaustion and inability to establish positive buoyancy. Examination of the equipment revealed deliberate obstruction of the weight release mechanism. Investigators reviewed dive footage, dock surveillance, and access logs, identifying Joseph Drum as the only person who had handled Bantz's equipment prior to the dive. When first questioned, Drum denied any involvement and claimed he had never touched the weight system. Confronted with video evidence and forensic examination showing deliberate obstruction of the release mechanism, Drum later admitted disabling the weights. He acknowledged understanding the consequences and stated that Bantz's death was the result of his own negligence. Prosecutors concluded Drum had intentionally created a lethal underwater condition. He was charged with second-degree murder and, in 2017, convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. The dive shop suspended certification training and revised its safety protocols. It was October 5th, 2017, when the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of a state hiking preserve in New Mexico. The desert landscape stretched for miles, punctuated by steep cliff formations and narrow canyon approaches that had challenged hikers for decades. Temperatures hovered around 78 degrees, and a recent flash flood earlier in the week had shifted surface rock near several junctions, subtly altering familiar sightlines along the trail. Morel Trope, a 28-year-old environmental specialist, had become a familiar presence on these trails over the past 2 years. Her athletic build and methodical approach to hiking reflected her professional background in conservation work. She frequently documented trail conditions and reported vandalism to park authorities, earning both respect and resentment from various user groups. The preserve's trail system relied on a network of high-visibility directional markers positioned at critical junctions, particularly near cliff zones, where wrong turns could prove fatal. These metal posts, painted bright orange and installed after previous near-miss incidents, had been vandalized repeatedly in recent months. Trope's conflict with Cole Avers, a 32-year-old local resident, had escalated over several weeks following her reports of unauthorized off-trail vehicle activity. Avers, who worked in construction and spent weekends riding in the preserve, had grown increasingly hostile toward what he viewed as interference with his recreational activities. Text messages recovered from Avers' phone revealed escalating hostility toward Trope, including statements about redirecting her toward the ridge approach. Additional messages referenced the cliff junction specifically, noting that the route had caused serious injuries in the past and warning that a wrong turn there could be deadly. That afternoon, Trope began what she intended as a routine solo hike along the ridge trail system. The route, which she had completed dozens of times, normally took 3 hours and offered spectacular views of the surrounding canyon country. Footage recorded by another hiker filming a landscape panorama from a nearby overlook later helped investigators establish Trope's position and timing along the ridge trail shortly before the incident. The altered trail marker at the junction was documented separately during the investigation. Following the altered marker, Trope entered an unmaintained approach that led toward a cliff zone rather than continuing along the established trail. The terrain consisted of loose scree and talus, unstable rock formations marked as hazardous in park documentation. The rotated marker served as the primary directional guide at the junction due to the natural funneling of foot traffic between rock walls. Any closure notices were positioned further down the closed approach beyond the initial turn and not visible from the main trail. The footage captured the moment when the loose scree beneath Trope's footing gave way. She fell approximately 40 feet onto the rocky surface below, sustaining massive trauma. The injuries were immediately fatal due to the combination of blunt force trauma and the height of the impact. Emergency responders reached the scene several hours later after the hiker who recorded the footage reported the incident. The challenging terrain required specialized equipment, delaying recovery efforts until the following morning. Investigation of the trail marker revealed clear evidence of deliberate tampering. Tool marks on the metal post indicated it had been forcibly rotated using mechanical leverage. The marker's original position would have directed hikers away from the cliff approach. When confronted with the evidence, Avers acknowledged altering the trail marker, but denied intending serious harm. Phone records confirmed his presence in the area on the day the marker was tampered with. Investigators also discovered that Avers had previously ridden his vehicle through the cliff approach area and was familiar with the dangerous terrain. The coroner's report confirmed death by blunt force trauma resulting from the fall. Investigators concluded that the deliberately altered trail marker directly contributed to Trope's fatal deviation from the safe route. Avers was initially charged in connection with the intentional tampering of trail safety equipment. Prosecutors later pursued a second-degree murder charge, arguing that he knowingly created a strong probability of fatal harm by redirecting hikers toward a documented cliff hazard. He was convicted and, citing aggravating factors related to deliberate safety tampering, sentenced to more than 20 years in prison. It was November 18, 2017, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Cold autumn air settled over rows of single-story homes as families gathered indoors for the evening. Evander Fairfax, a 42-year-old insurance investigator, had built a reputation for authority within his field, but internal complaints later revealed a pattern of falsified inspection reports and manipulated claims. Investigators would eventually document how he leveraged his position to benefit businesses tied to friends and relatives, often targeting smaller competitors with fabricated safety violations. One of those targets was Leander Blackthorne, a third-generation construction company owner known locally for dependable work. His family's business had survived decades of economic shifts, but during a competitive municipal contract bid worth over $2 million, Evander filed damaging reports alleging fraud and unsafe practices. Witnesses later testified that several claims were supported by falsified documentation. Legal fees and lost contracts forced Leander to sell the company below market value. Not long after, his elderly father suffered a fatal heart attack following the collapse of the business. When Evander's brother-in-law won the municipal contract and Evander received a promotion, Leander began studying his former adversary's routines, using his background in construction and electrical work to plan retaliation. On December 5th, Evander remained alone in his home office while preparing for a case review. Weeks earlier, investigators later determined Leander had entered the residence posing as an independent contractor responding to a minor electrical service request. Security cameras captured him near the property during that period. Fire investigators would later conclude that a high-resistance connection had been intentionally introduced into the office wiring, allowing heat to build gradually without immediately tripping circuit protection. The office smoke detector was also found non-functional. That evening, 11 electrical arcing developed within the altered wiring, igniting nearby materials inside the office walls. At first, the fire remained hidden, producing smoke that accumulated rapidly in the enclosed room. As conditions worsened, visibility dropped, and toxic gases filled the space within minutes. Investigators determined that the office doorway became impassable as flames intensified. The window appeared unobstructed, but its internal crank mechanism had been jammed, preventing it from opening. Without early alarm warnings, Evander remained unaware of the danger until escape routes were already compromised. Neighbors noticed smoke only after the fire had grown beyond control. By the time emergency crews arrived, the environment inside the office had become fatal. Fire analysis revealed deliberate electrical tampering inconsistent with accidental failure. Surveillance footage placed Leander near the property days before the incident, and purchase records showed a specialized electrical component used in the modification had been obtained through an inactive account linked to his former company. During interrogation and later court testimony, he admitted responsibility for altering the wiring system. Prosecutors argued that the modifications demonstrated premeditated intent to cause a deadly fire while masking the act as an accident. Following a month-long trial, Leander was convicted of arson and murder. Character witnesses described his previously spotless reputation, but forensic evidence and his own admission established the sequence of events. He received a life sentence, bringing the investigation to a close and ending a case that investigators later described as a calculated act of revenge hidden within the appearance of an electrical accident. It was December 28, 2016, in an urban neighborhood in Pennsylvania. The air was just above freezing. Narrow streets flanked older three-story apartment buildings with basement utility rooms. Raymond Keller, 58, owned 7 apartment buildings and often handled repairs himself to avoid contractor costs. Tenants described him as reluctant to spend on maintenance and unresponsive to complaints. One of those tenants, 37-year-old Luis Vega, had rented a one-bedroom apartment for 5 years and had never missed a rent payment. In late August 2016, Luis underwent emergency surgery for a severe bacterial infection and remained hospitalized and sedated for 13 days. During that time, his September rent payment came due. On September 4th, with rent 4 days late, Raymond went to the apartment and found no one home. Rather than attempting to contact Luis or starting the legal eviction process, which typically takes weeks with proper notice and court hearings, Raymond changed the locks on September 5th. On September 6th, he hired day laborers to remove all of Luis's belongings, which were taken to a disposal facility and destroyed, including irreplaceable items like his deceased mother's jewelry, his father's military medals, and important documents. After discharge on September 10th, Luis returned to find an empty unit. Raymond refused to return belongings or his security deposit. Luis lost his job weeks later. By mid-November, he was sleeping in his car, homeless, and struggling through the cold fall weather. On a cold evening in late December, Luis watched Raymond enter one of his buildings around 6:45 p.m. with a tool bag. The building was a 3-story structure with 14 units and a basement housing laundry facilities and utilities. After waiting over an hour, Luis used an unlocked rear door that tenants used for trash disposal to reach the basement around 8:05 p.m. He found Raymond kneeling by an open electrical panel, replacing a circuit breaker, with tools spread on the floor. Luis confronted Raymond about the illegal eviction, demanding his belongings or compensation. Raymond dismissed him and told him to leave, or he would call authorities. What followed later appeared in the scene reconstruction. A blow with a metal pipe found leaning against the basement wall felled Raymond. Drag marks and scuffs led approximately 30 feet to a small storage room where he was positioned inside. A heavy metal shelving unit stacked with paint cans and supplies was pushed against the door, which opened inward, preventing it from opening more than a few inches. Back at the panel, plier marks on 2 energized conductors showed a deliberate cross-contact had been forced. Sparks and heat ignited cardboard boxes and old paint-soaked rags stored improperly nearby. Within minutes, smoke collected at the ceiling and spread along wooden joists. Upstairs, a first-floor tenant later recounted smelling smoke around 8:48 p.m. and immediately calling for help. The building's smoke alarms activated at 8:50 p.m. In the basement, smoke pushed through the storage room door gap. Raymond regained consciousness, disoriented from the head injury, aware only of smoke filling the dark storage room. He struggled against the door but couldn't move the heavy shelving blocking it from outside. As alarms sounded upstairs and tenants evacuated, smoke and heat built rapidly around him. Fire crews arrived at 8:56 p.m. but couldn't reach the basement stairs until 9:21 p.m. due to heavy flames. They forced the door open at 9:24 p.m. and found Raymond collapsed near the threshold. Examiners later confirmed he died from smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning, with the head injury occurring before the fire began. Soot composition in Luis's car and on clothing later matched burned materials from the basement. Fingerprints were found on the pipe, the shelving unit, and the pliers at the electrical panel. Video from a nearby storefront captured Luis entering and leaving through the rear door within the window in which smoke first appeared. Witnesses from the shelter where Luis had stayed confirmed his ongoing anger toward Raymond over the illegal eviction. The death was ruled a homicide and arson. A court convicted Luis of first-degree murder and arson. He received life without parole. The building suffered heavy structural damage and was later demolished. It was November the 19th, 2017, along a commercial fishing pier on the Oregon coast, where early morning fog hung low over the water and wind gusts were already reaching 30 miles per hour. The weathered wooden structure extended 200 feet into the harbor, lined with mooring cleats and electrical hookups for the small charter boats that operated from the facility. Storm warnings had been issued for later that day, with conditions expected to deteriorate rapidly as a Pacific front moved inland. Orion Cade, a 42-year-old charter boat captain, had arrived before dawn to prepare his vessel for what would likely be the last fishing trip before the weather turned dangerous. He operated on narrow profit margins, making every available day on the water crucial for his livelihood. Cade was known for his meticulous preparation and conservative approach to safety, traits that had kept him incident-free during 15 years of coastal fishing operations. Cade had recently ended a tumultuous 3-year relationship with Evan Pike, a dock worker in his mid-30s who also kept a small sailboat at the harbor. The breakup had been contentious, with disputes over shared property and accusations of infidelity. Pike had been ordered by the court to stay at least 100 yards away from Cade, following incidents of harassment and threatening phone calls. Pike had violated the restraining order multiple times, showing up at locations where Cade was known to dock and leaving hostile messages on his boat. Text messages recovered later from Pike's phone contained threats about making Cade regret the breakup and references to ensuring he understood the consequences of his actions. That morning, Cade was working alone on his 24-foot fishing boat, preparing nets and checking equipment while the vessel remained tied to the pier. The boat's engine was idling in preparation for departure, with the propeller intermittently engaged as wind and line tension affected the drivetrain. Security cameras mounted on nearby light poles captured Pike moving along the pier structure approximately 30 minutes before the incident occurred. Pike used a utility knife to cut through a secondary tension line that helped stabilize boats during high wind conditions. As the severed line released tension, the boat yawed sharply in the strengthening wind. The sudden lateral movement caused Cade to lose his footing on the wet deck. He stumbled toward the stern as the vessel lurched, unable to regain balance as the hull shifted beneath him. Cade fell overboard near the stern while the engine remained engaged at idle. His legs struck the rotating propeller as he entered the water, causing catastrophic lower limb trauma. Blood spread rapidly across the surface as he was forced briefly against the hull before slipping beneath the water. The boat continued to move erratically in the wind until the engine eventually stalled. Harbor Patrol responded to reports of an unmanned vessel drifting near the pier. Rescue divers recovered Cade's body 22 minutes after the initial emergency call, but he had already succumbed to blood loss and trauma from the propeller strike. The medical examiner determined that the combination of severe laceration and cold water exposure had caused rapid incapacitation. Investigators found the severed tension line and matched tool marks to equipment in Pike's possession. Security footage showed him in the area during the time frame when the sabotage occurred, clearly violating his restraining order. Pike initially denied involvement, but later admitted to cutting the line, claiming he only intended to inconvenience Cade. Phone records and witness statements contradicted Pike's claim. Harbor workers reported seeing Pike watching Cade's morning routine from a distance on previous days. Digital forensics revealed Pike had researched the pier's security camera blind spots in the weeks prior to the incident. Prosecutors argued that Pike's harassment and premeditated actions demonstrated reckless disregard for human life. Pike was charged with second-degree murder, but after plea negotiations, he was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. The court determined that while Pike may not have specifically intended to kill Cade, he had deliberately created a dangerous situation knowing Cade would be aboard the vessel. He was sentenced to 15 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after serving 85% of his sentence. The case prompted new security measures at the harbor and stricter enforcement of restraining orders in maritime settings. It was April 7, 2016, at a warehouse loading dock in Missouri, where a 9-foot-high concrete platform lined with pallets and bay doors created a crowded, hazardous work area. Garrick Wade, a 52-year-old dock supervisor, had worked at the facility for nearly 8 years and was known for his strict adherence to safety protocols and company regulations. His methodical approach to warehouse operations had earned him respect from management but occasional friction with workers who preferred shortcuts. He took pride in maintaining an accident-free record and was quick to reprimand employees who violated established safety guidelines. That afternoon, Garrick had been conducting his routine inspection when he noticed an unusual arrangement of empty pallets near Bay Door 7. The wooden structures had been stacked in an unstable configuration, leaning precariously against the bay door frame at a steep angle that blocked one of the main walkways. The arrangement violated multiple safety protocols and created a potential hazard for anyone working in the area. Leo Munson, a 47-year-old warehouse worker, had deliberately arranged the pallets earlier that day to disrupt operations and get back at Garrick for a recent safety violation citation. 2 weeks prior, Garrick had written Leo up for operating a forklift without proper safety checks, resulting in a formal reprimand. The citation had cost Leo his perfect attendance bonus and damaged his standing with supervisors. Leo's plan was simple: create a minor obstruction that would slow down operations and force Garrick to spend time reorganizing the workspace. He believed the unstable stack would collapse when disturbed, creating a disruption that would force Garrick to intervene without considering how dangerous the falling pallets could be. He had positioned the pallets during his lunch break, propping them against the door frame in a way that appeared stable but would collapse easily if touched. The forklift-mounted camera system captured what followed. Garrick approached the unstable pallet stack and began examining the arrangement. The wooden structures had been balanced precariously against the bay door frame, with several pallets leaning at a dangerous angle. The stack extended nearly 8 feet high, supported only by friction against the metal frame. As Garrick moved closer to inspect the base, he reached out to brace one of the leaning pallets. The moment he applied pressure, the entire arrangement began to shift and topple forward. The sudden movement caught him off guard, and as he instinctively stepped backward, his foot caught on an uneven section of the concrete surface. Garrick stumbled backward, losing his balance as the stack collapsed toward him. As he fell, the back of his head struck the raised metal edge of the loading dock's built-in tie-down rail with devastating force. The impact caused severe traumatic brain injury. The heavy wooden pallets, each weighing approximately 40 pounds, then cascaded down from nearly 8 feet, striking his chest and torso and pinning him to the ground. Other warehouse workers immediately called for emergency assistance and attempted to remove the pallets, but he had stopped breathing within moments. Emergency personnel arrived within 14 minutes, but Garrick was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined that the fatal injury was the severe head trauma from striking the dock rail, while the falling pallets caused additional injuries, but were not the primary cause of death. The investigation revealed that Leo had intentionally arranged the pallets in the unstable configuration, and security footage confirmed his involvement. Investigators determined that while Leo had not intended to cause Garrick's death, his deliberate creation of a safety hazard had directly led to the fatal accident. Leo was subsequently charged with involuntary manslaughter in the first degree. Investigators determined that while he had not intended to kill Garrick, his deliberate creation of a dangerous workplace trap showed reckless disregard for human life and directly caused Garrick's death. The facility temporarily suspended loading dock operations, while safety inspectors conducted a review. Management instituted new policies requiring immediate reporting of unusual pallet arrangements or potential safety hazards to prevent similar incidents. It was November 12, 2015, inside a sheet metal fabrication plant on the south edge of Toledo, Ohio. The morning shift started routinely. Machines cycled, supervisors gathered staff, and a safety demonstration was scheduled to address a labor dispute during regular operations. Ronald Pierce was 44, a production supervisor who rose through the ranks rather than through college. He managed output schedules, enforced quotas, and cultivated fear as efficiency. Co-workers described him as precise, confrontational, and publicly dismissive of complaints. He believed safety guards slowed production and framed injuries as personal failures. His authority came from experience, not trust, reinforced by management bonuses tied to uninterrupted production weeks. He rarely documented warnings and routinely pressured subordinates to improvise around disabled safeguards to meet deadlines during inspection gap periods. Evan Brooks, 33, worked the same presses for 11 years and knew their sounds and limits. He reported repeated near misses to OSHA after a co-worker lost 2 fingers. The report threatened a shutdown. Ronald denied Evan severance and labeled him unreliable. Evan stayed on during his final notice period to train replacements, memorizing circuits, relays, and how neglect hid behind normal operation. He understood hydraulic timing and the emergency stop relay well enough to change behavior without leaving visible damage during routine morning maintenance checks before inspectors arrived late that day, eventually. That morning, Ronald ordered a live demonstration to prove the guards were unnecessary to visiting managers. The hydraulic press handled thick steel panels and cycled with enough force to shear bone. OSHA warnings were pending, and a cold rain had slowed deliveries, increasing pressure to appear compliant. Evan was instructed to operate the controls while Ronald positioned himself beside the die. No lockout procedures were followed. Several workers expressed concern but were told to watch quietly and learn. Training cameras were already running overhead for documentation and insurance purposes that same morning. When the cycle began, the press dropped with more speed than anyone expected. The ram descended as Ronald leaned in mid-sentence, his right arm extended inside the operating space to demonstrate clearance. Evan pressed the activation pedal. The safety light remained green. There was no pause. The steel die closed around flesh. Ronald's arm was dragged inward up to the shoulder in a fraction of a second. The sound was sharp and unmistakable. Bone cracking under hydraulic force. The muscle collapsed and tore as the press continued its stroke without resistance. Blood struck the clear shield and sprayed outward, then poured straight down, spreading rapidly beneath the machine. Ronald staggered once, knees buckling, his face draining of color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stayed upright only long enough for the next cycle to begin. 2 operators slammed the emergency stop again and again. The press did not stop. Each cycle drove the crushed arm tighter, forcing blood out in thick pulses onto the floor. Ronald collapsed sideways against the frame, consciousness fading as shock set in. When the power was finally cut, his arm was no longer intact, and the bleeding had already overwhelmed his circulation. The training camera recorded everything without interruption: the descent, the compression, the repeated cycles, and the moment Ronald stopped moving. By the time the machine went silent, his body lay still beneath it. Blood pooled wide across the concrete, internal failure already irreversible before anyone could reach him. The coroner reported massive crush trauma to the right arm, complete bone fragmentation, and catastrophic blood loss. Internal organs showed a shock response. Death occurred within minutes despite intervention. Machine logs confirmed the emergency stop relay had been deliberately bypassed, preventing it from interrupting the cycle. The injury was immediately unsurvivable without rapid surgical control. Autopsy photographs documented tissue destruction consistent with hydraulic force, and no evidence of defensive movement after initial compression occurred inside the press. The plant was shut down permanently within 48 hours. OSHA cited multiple violations tied to prior complaints. Workers were laid off without severance. Ronald's management bonuses were revoked posthumously, and the company dissolved its regional operations by year's end under mounting legal pressure. Evan Brooks remained on site and was interviewed along with other employees. He was arrested 3 months later after forensic electrical analysis identified unauthorized jumper wiring inside the press control system. He was charged with aggravated murder and workplace sabotage, convicted in 2017, and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. The training footage remains in use nationwide as a fatal retaliation case study. It was October 14, 2016, at a remote public campground within a national forest in northern Idaho, roughly 3 hours from Spokane. The low-elevation site was surrounded by mixed pine and hardwood trees, with posted bear warnings and limited cell service that dropped completely beyond the access road. Michael Mike Biddlespash, 32, had come to the campground with his twin brother, Bruce Biddlespash, 32, for what Bruce described as a short weekend trip to settle family matters. The brothers had been estranged for months following the death of their father and a bitter dispute over the estate. Mike believed the inheritance had been divided unfairly. Bruce believed Mike had manipulated their father during the final years. Neither accusation had been resolved. They arrived in the early afternoon and set up camp near the tree line. Mike drank steadily as the evening approached, consuming several beers and a bottle of liquor he had brought with him. Bruce remained sober. As night fell, the conversation turned into an argument that escalated quickly. Voices carried through the trees. Witnesses at a nearby site later reported hearing shouting, followed by a sudden crash. During the confrontation, Bruce shoved Mike away from the fire ring. Mike stumbled backward, his footing unsteady from alcohol, and fell onto exposed rocks near the edge of the campsite. He struck his lower leg and wrist, crying out in pain. Bruce did not call for help. Instead, he watched as Mike struggled to stand and failed. His ankle was visibly swollen, and he could not bear weight. Mike attempted to calm himself and asked Bruce for assistance. Bruce did not respond. He gathered his belongings slowly, methodically, while Mike remained seated on the ground. Before leaving, Bruce removed the car keys from the shared pack, took Mike's phone under the pretense of checking the battery, and kept it. He also removed the bear spray and headlamp from the campsite and extinguished the fire. Food was left unsecured. The tent flap remained partially open. Bruce drove away just after sunset. Mike was left alone, injured and intoxicated, with no light, no phone, and no way to leave the area. Overnight temperatures dropped steadily. Alcohol impaired his ability to regulate body heat and dulled his awareness as the cold set in. Unable to walk far and disoriented, he remained near the campsite, attempting unsuccessfully to relight the fire using damp wood. By early morning, Mike's movements slowed. He crawled partway into the tent but did not fully close it. Sometime before dawn, he lost consciousness. Mike Biddlespash died from hypothermia during the night. Animal activity occurred later. Rangers would later document scavenging consistent with local wildlife, including bears, but found no evidence of predatory behavior prior to death. The injuries caused by animals were determined to be post-mortem. Bruce did not report Mike missing. He returned to the city and told family members that Mike had chosen to stay behind to cool off. When Mike failed to respond to messages, relatives assumed he had left the area on his own. 3 days later, a hiker reported an abandoned campsite and a strong odor near the tree line. Rangers located Mike's body shortly afterward. The scene showed signs of injury, exposure, and prolonged cold stress. Toxicology confirmed significant alcohol intoxication. Medical examiners ruled the cause of death as hypothermia, with contributing factors including alcohol impairment and physical injury preventing self-rescue. Investigators reviewed vehicle data, campground cameras, and GPS records. Bruce's car was shown leaving the area alone that evening. Phone records confirmed he had possession of Mike's device overnight. When questioned, Bruce initially claimed Mike had been uninjured and had insisted on staying behind. Confronted with forensic evidence and witness statements from nearby campers who heard the altercation, Bruce admitted to pushing his brother during the argument and leaving him behind. He acknowledged that Mike was drunk, injured, and unable to leave on his own. Prosecutors concluded Bruce Biddlespash had intentionally abandoned his brother in conditions he knew were dangerous after causing the injury that made escape impossible. The death was ruled deliberate and foreseeable. Bruce Biddlespash was charged with second-degree murder. In 2018, he was convicted and sentenced to 22 years to life in state prison. The case closed with authorities stating that while the forest claimed Mike's life, the decision that sealed his fate was made hours earlier, by the person he trusted most. It was March 12, 2015, in western Pennsylvania, as a winter storm moved through the region, knocking out power across multiple neighborhoods and forcing residents to rely on emergency heating and backup electricity. Snow and ice accumulated rapidly, and by nightfall, entire streets sat dark and silent under deteriorating conditions. Santry Pike was 34 years old and worked as a maintenance technician for a local facility. He lived in a duplex on Maple Street, sharing the building with 59-year-old Harold Metz, a retired factory supervisor. The two men occupied separate units, but shared utilities and access points had become a source of ongoing conflict. Over several months, disagreements over noise, shared spaces, and storm preparations had escalated into persistent hostility. The tension reached a breaking point days before the storm, when Pike reported Metz to the property owner for tampering with shared utility controls. Records later showed that the complaint resulted in a formal warning to Metz. Text messages recovered during the investigation indicated that Metz viewed the report as a personal betrayal and had expressed intent to retaliate during the next major outage. The duplex physical layout played a critical role. Pike's unit relied on a rear steel storm door as its primary exit during power failures, as snow accumulation often blocked the front entrance. The door was secured by a manual latch system accessible from the outside. The basement, where Pike stored emergency equipment, had limited ventilation and a single stairwell leading to the main floor. As the storm intensified on the evening of March 12th, regional power grids failed. Pike activated a gas-powered generator in the basement to maintain limited electricity for heating equipment. Investigators later confirmed that the generator was operating as designed. However, carbon monoxide began accumulating due to inadequate ventilation, slowly spreading upward through the structure. Security footage from a neighboring building later showed Metz entering the rear alley during the height of the storm. He was seen positioning a metal bar against the storm door's latch mechanism before leaving the area. The timing coincided with the generator's continued operation inside the duplex. As carbon monoxide levels increased, Pike attempted to leave for his overnight shift. Footage captured his movements near the rear exit as he tried repeatedly to open the storm door. The metal bar wedged against the latch prevented it from opening. His movements became uncoordinated as exposure continued. Pike collapsed on the rear stairwell before reaching the main floor. The obstruction at the exit prevented escape and delayed any chance of outside assistance. The generator continued running until fuel depletion, allowing carbon monoxide to saturate the enclosed space. Emergency responders were alerted the following morning after neighbors noticed the generator had stopped and received no response from inside the unit. First responders found Pike's body on the stairwell near the rear exit. Carbon monoxide readings inside the structure remained elevated, and combustion byproducts from the generator were documented in the basement. The coroner's report confirmed carbon monoxide poisoning as the cause of death. Investigators recovered the metal bar still lodged against the storm door latch and obtained phone records showing Metz's messages referencing retaliation during the storm. The physical evidence established that Pike had been deliberately prevented from exiting the building while hazardous conditions developed inside. Metz was charged with third-degree murder for deliberately blocking the exit while knowing a generator was running inside. He was convicted and sentenced to multiple decades in prison for what prosecutors called calculated retaliation, not an accident. It was April 3, 2018, at a small medical clinic in suburban Portland, Oregon. The spring morning was overcast as patients arrived for routine appointments at the facility serving the area's working-class population. Isadora Whitlock was a 38-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative. Industry colleagues later described her sales tactics as aggressive, prioritizing commission-generating brand-name medications over generic alternatives. Dr. Evangeline Pemberton was a 42-year-old physician who had attempted to open a low-cost community clinic. She had invested substantial personal funds into facility planning, equipment purchases, and renovations. The The clinic's business model focused on providing generic medications at cost with sliding scale fees. Isadora had identified Dr. Pemberton's planned clinic as a competitive threat to her pharmaceutical sales territory. The clinic's focus on generic medications threatened prescription volume targets tied to her regional sales incentives and performance bonuses. Court documents later revealed that Isadora had contacted the building owner with fabricated claims that Dr. Pemberton was financially unstable and planning to use the facility for improper purposes. She also offered the building owner pharmaceutical supply contracts for his other medical properties that would generate more revenue than Dr. Pemberton's lease. The building owner terminated Dr. Pemberton's lease weeks before the planned opening. Dr. Pemberton lost her investment and was subsequently employed as a medication coordinator at a small clinic working under her maiden name. Isadora began making regular visits to the clinic where Dr. Pemberton now worked, apparently unaware of her identity. As a pharmaceutical representative, Isadora had routine access to the facility to promote medications to medical staff. The incident occurred during Isadora's routine visit on Tuesday, May 15th. She had been experiencing symptoms consistent with diabetes. Dr. Pemberton, in her role as medication coordinator, processed Isadora's examination and confirmed she had been prescribed rapid-acting insulin requiring precise dosing. The fatal episode occurred on June 7th when Isadora was driving during morning rush hour. She experienced a severe hypoglycemic episode that caused confusion, loss of coordination, and eventual unconsciousness while driving. Her vehicle drifted into oncoming traffic and collided with a delivery truck at 9:30 a.m. Emergency responders found Isadora unconscious with severe trauma and critically low blood sugar levels. She was pronounced dead at the hospital. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was massive trauma from the collision, with contributing factor of severe hypoglycemia. Blood toxicology revealed extremely elevated levels of fast-acting insulin in her system, inconsistent with her prescribed medication and dosage. The concentration indicated administration of a rapid-acting insulin formulation inconsistent with her prescribed type and dosing schedule. Investigators examined pharmacy records at the clinic. The medication tracking system showed Dr. Pemberton had accessed the controlled substance storage area on multiple occasions when she was not scheduled for medication coordination duties. Security footage revealed her accessing the medication storage area associated with Isadora's prescriptions on 3 separate dates over a 3-week period. Pharmacy inventory records showed discrepancies in fast-acting insulin stock that coincided with the dates Dr. Pemberton had accessed the storage area. The missing insulin matched the potency level found in Isadora's toxicology report. Investigators later confirmed Dr. Pemberton had accessed a clinic workstation to review medical database entries related to insulin overdose and hypoglycemia while driving, with searches logged between May 15th and June 7th. When confronted with pharmacy discrepancies and surveillance footage, she gave a recorded confession, admitting she had tampered with Isadora's insulin supply by introducing a rapid-acting formulation inconsistent with her prescribed dosing over several weeks. Prosecutors filed first-degree murder charges, citing documented planning, medical research history, and toxicology findings. Dr. Pemberton pleaded guilty in court and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her medical license was permanently revoked. It was May 25, 2017, in a mid-sized city in Oregon. A light rain fell over downtown, glass towers reflecting a low, silver sky. Commuters moved through the grid in steady streams at the end of the workday. Scott Mercer was 38, a senior accountant at a regional manufacturing firm with a corner office on the 14th floor. In early spring, he had compiled documentation of millions in fraud across 2 fiscal years. After submitting evidence to federal authorities, an unannounced audit began in early May. His supervisor, Chief Financial Officer Vincent Kemp, 45, had personally authorized the fraudulent transactions and now faced prison time and career destruction. Scott kept a predictable routine. Arriving at 6:45 a.m. each day, he would immediately pour himself a large mug of cold brew coffee from a personal bottle he kept in the small kitchenette refrigerator. In late May, building security footage captured Vincent entering the 14th floor at 5:48 a.m., more than an hour before his usual arrival time. He wore latex gloves and spent 9 minutes in the kitchenette area before leaving. Vincent had used a syringe to inject approximately 150 milliliters of ethylene glycol directly into Scott's 32-ounce cold brew bottle. Ethylene glycol is sweet-tasting, colorless, and blends easily with coffee. The dose was carefully calculated. 100 to 150 milliliters is typically fatal to an adult, causing acute kidney failure and severe metabolic acidosis. Scott arrived at 6:45 a.m. to prepare audit materials before the federal team arrived at 9. He poured his contaminated cold brew into his desk mug and began working. Over the next 50 minutes, he drank nearly the entire mug, consuming approximately 24 ounces of the poison mixture. By 7:40 a.m., he felt nauseous with a pounding headache. Then his vision blurred, and he felt confused and disoriented. He stood to get water but felt dizzy and sat back down, breathing rapidly. By around 8:10 a.m., Scott's condition deteriorated sharply. The ethylene glycol had metabolized into highly toxic compounds that attacked his kidneys and nervous system. His breathing became labored. He reached for his phone, but his hands trembled uncontrollably. Within minutes, he lost consciousness and slumped forward onto his desk. A colleague arriving at 8:35 a.m. found Scott unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin pale and cold. She immediately called 911. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes and rushed Scott to a medical facility where doctors initiated emergency dialysis and administered fompazole, an antidote for ethylene glycol poisoning. But the damage was extensive. Scott never regained consciousness and died at 12:17 p.m. from acute renal failure and cardiovascular collapse. Toxicology analysis detected lethal concentrations of ethylene glycol in Scott's blood, urine, and stomach contents. The cold brew bottle tested positive for contamination with a tiny puncture mark visible in the cap seal. Security footage showed Vincent entering the floor unusually early. His fingerprints were lifted from the refrigerator handle and the cold brew bottle itself, despite his use of gloves. Investigators discovered Vincent had purchased 2 gallons of Prestone antifreeze with cash 4 days prior. Parking lot footage captured his vehicle and license plate. A partially empty antifreeze jug and a 60-milliliter veterinary syringe recovered from a dumpster near Vincent's residence bore his fingerprints and tested positive for ethylene glycol residue. Phone records showed Vincent had called a veterinary supply company 3 days before, inquiring about large-capacity syringes. A handwritten note in Vincent's desk drawer contained calculations matching Scott's coffee bottle volume and lethal ethylene glycol dosage amounts. The death was ruled a homicide. Vincent was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The company faced millions in fines and delisting from the stock exchange, and 3 other executives received prison sentences for their roles in the fraud. It was March 7, 2018. In a 12-story office tower in downtown St. Louis, where late-evening maintenance work was being conducted during a scheduled power system test. The building's emergency lighting cast dim shadows through the corridors, and most tenants had left hours earlier. 2 emergency stairwells provided the primary evacuation routes, with Stairwell A typically remaining unlocked during maintenance operations, while Stairwell B was under a temporary security override. Selma Jory, a 51-year-old facilities supervisor, was conducting her final inspection of the day before the building's weekend closure. She was a veteran employee nearing retirement, known for her thorough approach to safety protocols and her dedication to maintaining building standards. Her colleagues described her as meticulous and professional. Mark Ellison, a 45-year-old maintenance contractor, had been working in the building for several years and was familiar with the emergency door systems. The magnetic door locks could be controlled remotely from the main security panel. 2 weeks earlier, Jory had hired Ellison for kitchen renovation work through his side handyman business. The results were substandard: crooked cabinets, faulty electrical work, and water damage. When Ellison refused refunds or repairs, Jory posted scathing reviews on Yelp, Google, and Facebook with photos of the shoddy work. Other customers came forward with similar complaints, and Ellison's side business collapsed overnight. Text messages from his phone showed growing anger, including threats to teach her a lesson. That evening, Jory was wearing a body-mounted safety camera, as required by building policy during solo inspections. An unrelated electrical fault within the building's ventilation control system had begun generating smoke that migrated upward through the stairwell shafts, though this was not immediately apparent. As Jory entered stairwell B to inspect the emergency lighting, Ellison activated the magnetic door override from the security panel. Because the building was undergoing a scheduled power system test, standard fire release interlocks for stairwell B were temporarily offline, leaving the magnetic lock engaged despite the smoke. He later admitted to investigators that he intended to trap her temporarily as payback for the online reviews, believing she would eventually be found when security made their rounds. The electrical fault suddenly worsened, filling stairwell B with thick smoke. Jory attempted to force the sealed door, but could not overcome the magnetic locking mechanism. The body camera recorded her increasingly desperate attempts to escape as smoke continued to accumulate. The concrete stairwell acted as a chimney, concentrating the smoke and reducing visibility to near zero. Jory lost her footing on the steps and fell down multiple concrete risers, striking her head and back against the hard surfaces. The body camera continued recording until the battery failed. Building security discovered the electrical fault during a routine sweep and initiated emergency ventilation procedures. Jory was found unconscious in stairwell B when responders forced the door open. She was pronounced dead at the scene from a combination of smoke inhalation and traumatic injuries sustained during the fall. Security system logs showed that the magnetic door lock had been activated from the main panel during the time frame when Jory was conducting her inspection. Ellison initially denied involvement, but later admitted to sealing the door, claiming he was unaware of the electrical fault and insisting he only meant to scare her. Investigators determined that while Ellison could not have anticipated the electrical malfunction, his deliberate action of confining Jory in the stairwell as retaliation for a personal grievance directly contributed to her death. Mark Ellison was charged with first-degree involuntary manslaughter. After a 3-week trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in state prison. During sentencing, the judge noted that Ellison's vindictiveness over negative online reviews had cost Selma Jory her life and devastated her family. Ellison showed minimal remorse during the proceedings, maintaining that he never intended for anyone to get hurt. The Jory family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against both Ellison and the building management company that settled for an undisclosed sum before trial. It was February 11, 2015, at a remote desert overlook in Nevada, 120 feet above the valley floor, where loose gravel, stone barriers, and winds made the cliff edge dangerous. Lida Jove, a 31-year-old administrative coordinator, had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. Known for her optimistic nature and willingness to work through relationship problems, she had been dating Marcos Rell for nearly 2 years. Their relationship had grown increasingly strained over the past several months, with frequent arguments about trust and commitment. Marcos, a 34-year-old warehouse supervisor known for his extreme jealousy and controlling behavior, had chosen this isolated overlook deliberately after seeing the photograph. Their relationship had already been strained by repeated arguments over Marcos's suspicions and Leda's naturally friendly nature, with several past confrontations fueled by his belief that she was hiding something from him. The remote location and dangerous cliff edge were not incidental. He had chosen the overlook because it offered privacy, isolation, and a setting that made confrontation unavoidable. Just after setting up, he received a photograph on his phone that appeared to show Leda with another man in an intimate situation, reinforcing the suspicions that had already fueled months of tension between them. The image showed Leda embracing someone outside a restaurant. The timestamp indicated it had been taken 3 days earlier, when Leda had told Marcos she was working late. The discovery convinced him that his worst suspicions were finally confirmed. Consumed by jealousy and humiliation, he began to think about revenge. When Leda arrived, she immediately sensed the change in Marcos's demeanor. His usual warm greeting was replaced by cold silence and barely contained rage. She attempted to approach him, but he deliberately stepped back toward the knee-height stone border, positioning himself between her and safety. A tourist hiking nearby captured the beginning of their argument on a smartphone camera before putting it away. The brief footage showed Leda and Marcos in heated discussion near the cliff edge, their body language tense and confrontational. Marcos confronted Leda with the photograph, his voice rising as he accused her of infidelity. As their argument escalated, Leda attempted to walk around him to return to their vehicle. Marcos moved to intercept her, grabbing her shoulders and forcing her backward toward the cliff edge. He intended to drive her to the edge and make sure she never left the overlook alive. As he forced her closer to the precipice, Marcos tightened his grip and deliberately shoved her backward toward the stone border. There was no hesitation. With one final push, he sent her over the knee-height barrier and into the open air below. Leda went over the cliff edge, striking several rock outcroppings during her 120-foot descent to the valley floor. The multiple impacts caused severe blunt force trauma to her head and torso, and she was pronounced dead when emergency responders reached her approximately 2 hours later. The investigation revealed that Marcos had chosen the dangerous location with intent to cause a fatal fall, deliberately positioning Leda near the cliff's edge as an act of revenge. Phone records later confirmed that the photograph had been taken 3 days earlier, when Leda had told Marcos she was working late. Investigators determined that she had been seeing another man, a discovery that became the trigger for Marcos's act of revenge. Marcos was charged with second-degree murder after investigators concluded that he had deliberately forced Leda over the cliff edge in a planned act of revenge. The case highlighted how acts of revenge, when driven by jealousy and rage, can become deliberate and irreversible acts of fatal violence. The overlook campsite was placed under temporary closure, and enhanced warning signage and protective fencing were subsequently installed at similar locations. It was May 11, 2015, at Klong Toi Market in Bangkok, Thailand. Heat rose from wet concrete. Vendors shouted prices, sliced fish and stacked greens. Buyers pressed through narrow aisles, bags brushing stalls. Deliveries arrived non-stop. Everything functioned on routine, noise, and speed. Morning traffic hummed nearby under fluorescent lights. One of the vendors was Sam Phan, 48, who had sold vegetables from the same corner stall for almost 20 years. She bought produce from nearby farms, paid her market fees on time, and depended on regular customers like street food cooks and small restaurants. She was direct, protective of her space, and serious about foot traffic. Losing customers meant falling behind on rent. 2 stalls away was May Ratan, 42, newer to the market and loud about selling. She lowered prices by a few baht and openly called out to Sam's regulars as they walked past. What started as complaints turned into daily shouting. Market supervisors told both women to calm down, but never stepped in. That morning, a noodle shop owner glanced at Sam's stall, hesitated, then walked past and bought vegetables from May instead. It wasn't the first time. Vendors nearby heard May call out prices louder than usual, clearly aiming at Sam's regulars. Sam went still, jaw tight, then slammed her metal scale onto the table hard enough to rattle nearby produce. Customers stepped back. She accused May of stealing buyers and undercutting on purpose. May shouted back, saying customers could choose whoever they wanted. The argument grew louder as Sam pushed through the aisle toward the shared wash area behind the stalls. She was no longer trying to sell, only to confront. May followed closely, still yelling, refusing to drop it. Other vendors avoided getting involved, pretending to work. The narrow corridor behind the stalls was wet and cramped, crowded with plastic crates, tangled hoses, and open buckets of cleaning chemicals everyone used, leaving little room to move or calm down. CCTV later showed May reaching for a wide plastic basin filled with a strong cleaning solution meant for scrubbing vegetable boxes. As Sam turned back to face her, the argument escalated. May stepped forward and drove the basin into Sam's upper body. The liquid surged upward, splashing directly into Sam's face, eyes, and chest. The chemical soaked into her skin instantly. Sam screamed and dropped her hands to her eyes, clawing at them as the burning intensified. She stumbled blindly out of the corridor toward the main aisle, knocking into a crate. Her feet slipped on the wet concrete. She fell backward without bracing, her head striking a steel post with a sharp hollow crack that cut through the market noise. Her body went limp on the floor. Vendors nearby froze, stunned by the sound. Others backed away, shouting for help. Market security was called at 8:52 a.m. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes later and found Sam unresponsive. Her face and neck were badly burned, her eyes swollen shut. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. She never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The post-mortem found serious chemical burns to her eyes, mouth, and throat. The head injury showed a skull fracture and bleeding inside the brain. The coroner ruled that the chemical splash caused instant disorientation and loss of vision, leading to the fall that killed her within minutes. Afterward, Sam's stall stayed closed. Regular customers left flower garlands on the metal frame. May was arrested after vendors testified and CCTV confirmed the shove. She was charged with assault, resulting in death, and later sentenced to 18 years in prison. Market officials banned strong cleaning chemicals and reassigned stalls. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.